Hello everyone, welcome to another artwork analysis. Now previously I talked about Santa Claus and how it was a very iconic design and why it worked. Now I figured it might be more fun if I were to talk about characters that are more relevant to it. Well, I guess Santa Claus is still relevant, but some characters who are more recent, and particularly in video game media. And why not talk about the classics, the Nintendo characters? I figured because they have been in our entertainment industry for so long that something must be working, right? A lot of cases, yes, and it's one of those things where people resonate with really good designs, even if it's subconscious. And I wanted to really kind of break down a bit of why the Nintendo characters work. So, first, I want to talk about color identity. I'll be analyzing four different characters, by the way, and I'm sure you'll know all of them. Number two, I would talk about the values and what makes each of these characters stand out from a value standpoint without looking into the colors. And then three, I want to talk about in general other design choices that kind of popped up with me with these four characters. So, first, let's talk about color identity because it's the simplest way to really make these characters stand out. So first, look at Mario. We know immediately that the colors of Mario are really saturated, and one particular thing with creating family-friendly characters is that, generally speaking, kids resonate with more saturated colors. It's something that children's books tend to utilize in order to kind of distinguish people from environments and characters from different characters, that type of thing. So this is a very specific design choice that most kids media will do, and we can look into the other characters. So Pikachu. Now look at how this is a predominantly yellow character with accents of red. So meanwhile, Mario would be. You might notice that you could say the blue kind of takes over more of his body, but the red tends to be more prominent because number one, reds can be are tend to be very good for accents. They always stand out. Our perception tends to see reds more stark. And number two, look at where the reds are located on Pikachu and Mario. So on Mario, we tend to gravitate towards faces. So you see where the reds are. It's he's wearing a red hat type of thing. As with Pikachu as well, we're looking at his or her expression. So the reds will kind of lead our eyes towards it, even though it's a less prominent, less dominant color proportion wise. So let's look into Link as well from Zelda. So you notice that with each Nintendo character, there's a different dominant color, and you might notice that Link, of course, is green with accents of yellow, so it immediately will distinguish himself from the rest of the cast. And looking into Donkey Kong as well, another red accented character design. So in this case, brown is the prominent color, and then the red tie makes it stand out. So one particular thing I want to talk about is that these characters, we're talking over 30 years of history. I might be a bit wrong with that, but let me know. But 30 years, the technology to show these characters on in the video game has changed a lot. So one thing is that Reds, even when in the pixelated instance, will stand out. So Donkey Kong, the original Donkey Kong, you might notice that a lot of these characters, so Mario climbing up the ladders and stuff, they're all red accented so that they stand out and not blend into the background because they are obviously going to be limited in the colors they are allowed to use with the technology given at that time. So these character designs have stood out of the test of time because they can work in the most pixelated game possible, and also when it comes to obviously a three-dimensional rendering like this. Number two, I want to talk about values. So this is the less prominent thing because we tend to look into the really saturated colors of Nintendo characters and such, but we don't really think of how brilliant the distribution of values are. So if we were to just desaturate the whole character, what do you immediately see? It's that just like with good artwork, good compositions, we notice that the most stark contrasts are on the focal points. So you notice how the mustache on his face stands out. But one prominent thing that comes out immediately as well is the fact that his clothing, let's circle the clothing here. His entire clothing, his attire, are blended into one value. So why is that? So this comes down to a fundamental part of using values is that when you are using very stark colors, you don't really need crazy amounts of value contrast. Because if you had value contrast on top of color contrast, you end up creating crazy amount of contrast, especially with saturated colors. And this will create a probably way too crazy of a contrast and starts taking attention from the prominent focal point, which is, of course, his face. So notice how if I were to, let's say, change the values a bit. So I'm going to darken the blues here a bit. It's going to be very rough. Bear with me. Maybe brighten the reds here. So you notice immediately, even doing this really rough sketch, that the clothing starts kind of catching too much attention. And that's really not good design. So in this case, they are very aware that the clothing will kind of stand out with the colors alone. They don't need to be stood out with the values. So with Pikachu, let's look into Pikachu. Same idea. So of course this is a bit easier to notice since his or her body tends to be fully yellow, but you notice how it starts blending in, and the face is the prominent feature as with the ears. Of course, when we look from really far away, we're talking about Game Boy pixels and stuff. Having the dark ears and the dark eyes over a very uniform body will allow it to stand out. So Link, this one, now Link tends to be more realistic, but same idea really. The clothing tends to have one value throughout, and everything else tends to be, the face rather, tends to be tends to have a bit more contrast than usual. Donkey Kong, now same thing, but one particular thing to note is that with Donkey Kong, his features tend to create sort of a pattern throughout. So you now this is a very specific pose, but even in other poses, his chest kind of leaks into his face because of the value choices given. Now it might be hard to describe, but you can look into more pictures of Donkey Kong. You'll know what I mean. He'll always stand out. So number three, I want to talk about a few design choices. So this goes into gameplay as well. So when we look at Mario, we see that he's obviously proportioned in a very cartoonish manner. His head is massive compared to his body. Um, but there's certain things here and there that I want to talk about pertaining to gameplay. So, for instance, we noticed how the the arms and the legs here, they're actually very stocky. So we know if you've played Mario before that, Mario likes to step on stuff. He tends to use his fists when it comes to Super Smash Brothers and stuff. So you know from looking at Mario immediately what what type of character he is. He's very strong limbed, and that is really good design. We know from looking at him what he would probably do in a particular situation. He's gonna use his fists and feet. And the fact that his head is really big, now this is probably reading too much into it, but one thing in martial arts is that there's a stereotype where if your head is really big, you're kind of hard to knock out. And Mario in this case is his head is huge, so you know he's a very tough dude, especially when it comes to the fact that he's kind of pretty wide jawed. So that really pushes the idea that Mario is very tough. He might be a very cutesy proportioned guy, but he can punch and kick pretty well. So we can look into Pikachu as contrast. So Pikachu in the game uses lightning bolts and thunder to attack his or her enemies. So does he or her need? Well, I'm gonna say it. Does it need? Does he need? Does he or she? It's getting too complicated. Need bigger fists or feet? Probably not. So you notice that we look at Pikachu's limbs, they're kind of small. So this kind of puts it into perspective that yes, Pikachu will use special attacks instead of using fists or feet, even though it's more than capable of attacking with there's tackle and there's other attacks. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but generally speaking, not as prominent in terms of limbs. So look into Link. Now, very realistically proportioned, other than the fact that there is a very anime-ish face. That's really the iconic type of face that Link tends to have. But you notice from the way that he's holding the sword and shield that we can assume that yes, he will use sword and shield to attack. He's not particularly leaning towards anything cartoonish, so there's nothing being pushed in terms of his capabilities as a character. He's going to be using weapons, he's going to be using other stuff like hammers and bombs and stuff. He's not going to just punch and kick stuff. So, again, even though it's realistically proportioned, they could have made it more cartoonish as in bodybuilder type of body. But he's very lean. He's pretty much the underdog. He has to use his cunning, he has to use weaponry in order to defeat his foes. And finally, Donkey Kong, similar to Mario except exaggerated even more. We look at a very wide face. Then we look at how big his arms are, and his feet tends to be less prominent because Donkey Kong is a puncher, when it comes to a standing silhouette, he's very top heavy. So again, that pushes towards it. Again, these are design choices that are kind of their creative people figured out in order to create a sense of what their functions are when it comes to the gameplay. Anyways, there's a lot of things to talk about with Nintendo characters. Maybe I'll go into other ones as well. But otherwise, hopefully you enjoyed this and you learned something. Lots of stuff to talk about, really. Anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.